Do you see an opportunity for Macron and Merkel to work together and continue the project of European integration?
Well, there certainly is a huge chance for the European relationship between Berlin and Paris to be revamped. Of course, everyone in Berlin was watching the march of Le Pen towards the Élysée with a lot of fear. So they were on tenterhooks and were extremely relieved when Macron, the avowedly pro-European candidate, won that election last week. However, aside from his, pro-EU views, when it comes down to the detail, there is still a lot to work out. And primarily this comes down to the question of what the future of the Eurozone is going to be. Germany's position, that is not going to change. They do not want to have a permanent fiscal transfer union. And they're afraid that with France, and including some of the reforms that Macron has suggested, that they could be heading towards the pooling of debt. And that is not going to change from the Berlin perspective. They refuse to relinquish more cash without more budgetary oversight and control.
Okay, so there are a couple of sticking points there. We know that Germans will go to the poll later this year, September, I believe. And Emmanuel Macron, even though he was just inaugurated, will be up for re-election in 2022. So what kind of timeline does that give Macron and Merkel to consolidate German-French cooperation?
Well, they certainly know that they have to do something, and poor David Cameron, of course, who lost that referendum after trying to reform the EU last year, will probably be watching with his head in his hands. They know that they have to change something in the status quo because the rise of Euroscepticism across the continent is, of course, something that's primary on both their minds. And it's existential to the re-election of Macron in 2022. He knows that France, given the political troubles, the security issues, unless something is to change, then he, in 2022, faces a bigger challenge from Le Pen than he did this time. I think it's very clear, given what's happened in the regional elections in Germany, those three key elections that we saw this year, that Merkel is really the only contender to win the chancellorship again. And there will be some potential for some grand bargain between Paris and Berlin, but the devil remains in the detail. Before we can even get there, we have to first of all wait for Macron to put together his parliament. Of course, you have the Assemblée Nationale elections in June, and whether or not he can even put forward some of the reforms that he's proposed, whether or not he can be successful in that, not only domestically but also on the EU level, really depends on whether or not he can get support in the French parliament. Now, from Merkel's perspective, it looks as though she's going to sweep up in those elections in September, so I think the Queen of Europe remains very much in her seat.
Nina, let's just assume that somehow the French president actually manages to coordinate some level of support. How fiscally conservative is he going to be? Because if he tries to push it here, no matter how well their friendship is developing, Angela Merkel is going to step on him and say, "Oi, you need to behave." Those tensions could happen really soon.
I think that if Macron, and I understand that privately his advisors have, told people in Berlin, people close to Merkel, that they, first of all, want to sort out a lot of domestic issues. There are a lot of domestic reforms that they want to impose, including labor market reforms. And if he's able to get that through, then I think Berlin would be willing to cut him a little bit more leeway. But I certainly don't think that Berlin will agree to Eurobonds. And as I already mentioned, there will be no kind of fiscal pooling of debt without more budgetary oversight. So I think some of the proposals for a Eurozone budget, a Eurozone finance minister, we're still a way out of that. And I would also take Merkel's comments today in Berlin on the reopening of the treaties with a little bit, with a pinch of salt, because Germany is quite afraid of doing that and will only do that with more budgetary oversight and more control.
Nina, you mentioned that if Macron isn't successful, then we could see President Le Pen in 2022. What does success look like?
Good question.
Well, I think it's important to remember that a lot of Le Pen's supporters were actually very young when it comes to the case of France, unlike the youth who voted against Brexit, or perhaps the same phenomenon in the US with the election of Donald Trump, where they happened to be, the younger voters tended to be more liberal. That is certainly not the case in France. France still has a lot of economic problems, a very high unemployment rate, and unless there are some domestic reforms, and unless people, in fact, poll after poll shows that France is a more Eurosceptic country than even Great Britain was ahead of the referendum here. So unless there can be a real change, whatever that reform is to look like, and this is, of course, something that Macron himself knows, positioning himself as the candidate to deliver that change, by 2022, you could have a very febrile atmosphere in France.
You had given us this image of David Cameron sitting there with his head between his hands. Of course, the UK will be negotiating with the EU on what happens with Brexit, how it proceeds. How does his successor, Theresa May, leverage Macron off of Merkel or vice versa? Is there a way to do that?
Well, I think that Theresa May obviously has a challenge on her hands. Had it been President Le Pen, it would have been quite difficult for the UK because then the EU would have gone into existential overdrive and wouldn't have been able to concentrate much focus on the Brexit negotiations. But with Macron in the Elysée and Merkel presumably winning the chancellorship again in Germany, I think when it comes to Brexit, they're going to be united. They want to stamp out Euroscepticism. They will take one line negotiating with the UK, and it's going to be difficult for her going forward.